Welcome to another exciting installment, I hope exciting, of Biology 101. We're ready to actually start some of the material that we need to cover. Just an announcement, we will have a student instructor for the course. Her name is Chris Whitty, and Friday she's going to come in and find out what times would be best for doing review sessions. I think she's planning on doing either 2 or 3 a week, so I just thought I'd let you know. All right, so we're starting Chapter 1, which basically is concerned with what is biology, what are we doing here, what is science, and how is science done. So we've got some important concepts here that we need to look at. And if you've looked at these slideshows at all, if you've looked ahead, you'll find that the second slide in every slideshow is basically the big take-home messages that you should be getting out of this material. Okay, so first important concept. Study of biology is hierarchical. All right? That means that there are different levels of biology that we can study. Okay, we can study it at the organism level. We can study it at the ecosystem level, the molecular level. Okay, so there's lots of different levels at which we can study living systems. There are 2 different methods of studying science, and up until this 4th edition of the book, they've only indicated one, which was the hypothetico-deductive approach. But the observational approach is a very important approach, and it's especially important to look at because much of what we know about things like evolutionary biology are understood because of the observational and predictive approach. Right? They're not mutually exclusive. We can use both methods. All right, so when we're studying a biological phenomenon, we can look both at the hypothetical approach and we can look at the observational approach. All right? Both can be done almost simultaneously. And life's diversity is explained by evolution. I apologize if that word offends some of you, but that's the way it is. Nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. It's supported by a monstrously huge body of evidence and observation. It makes perfect sense given what we observe and what we experiment. Right? So those 3 concepts are things that I'll elaborate on as we go through this. Now, the figures that you'll see in these PowerPoint presentations are figures right out of your book. So you ought to be able to, if you are following along with these in front of your computer at home, you ought to be able to look at your book and find the appropriate figure and refer to it as I'm going through it. This is one of the first figures in the chapter. It shows the hierarchical system that we use when we do biology. As we go up in this figure, right, as we go up, we're looking at bigger and bigger levels to study biology. And as we go down, of course, we're looking at smaller and smaller and smaller levels until we get to the molecular level here at the bottom. What's being shown there is a molecule of DNA, which is near and dear to my heart, being a geneticist. All right, so bigger levels and smaller levels of study. What do all of these terms mean? Okay. You're about to get some definitions. And this is one of the major difficulties that students find in learning biology is learning the language. It's very much like learning a foreign language because a lot of these words you may not have been familiar with, you may not have been exposed to. Okay? So it's important to be able to learn the language of biology. Okay? So you may be completely unfamiliar with some of these terms. One thing you should do is take these definitions to heart. When I'm going through these PowerPoint presentations, I'll often have particular words in italics the first time I use them, and I'll try to define them at that point. Okay, so as soon as I use the word, I give you a good working definition for it, sometimes as little as a few words as a definition. But you need to learn the language. You need to know the language of biology, and that's going to be a major hurdle that you're going to have to overcome. How do you do it? Well, one way is to use homemade flashcards. If you're just a good brute force memorizer, that's a way to do it. If you're not as good a brute force memorizer, maybe you do better by learning these terms in context. That's where study groups are going to become very, very important, because you can use the language as you discuss these subjects with your friends that are also in the class and that sort of thing. Right? So study groups will play a key role here in learning the language. All right, so what are the definitions? Well, there's a whole bunch of them. Right? First, an ecosystem. An ecosystem is all of the living and non-living components of a particular area. That is the biotic and the abiotic. Okay, living and non-living components. Okay, so that would include all of the organisms living in the area, as well as mineral content, water amounts, soil conditions, all of those sorts of things are abiotic components of a particular system. Right? The biotic components by themselves are referred to as a community. So all the living organisms, no matter what their size, what they're doing, how they interact, those are all the community within that region, if you're just dealing with the biotic components. Okay, a population is all of the interbreeding and interacting individuals of a species. Okay? Very important concept here, though, is that this is within a species. Okay? Within a species. What's a species? Well, it's a group of individuals that can actually or potentially interbreed. Right? Now, stop and think about this a second. If they're in the same area, then probably they can actually interbreed with each other. All right? But if you have, say, a population of individuals in Europe and a population of individuals in the United States, and they potentially could interbreed with each other if there was some way for them to get together, they're the same species. It's sort of a philosophical concept there. If you went to another planet and you discovered a critter that looks exactly like a swan, you bring them back and you find out they can interbreed with our swans. By our definition, they're the same species, even though you might think, well, that's impossible. All right, so sort of a philosophy of science concept here. But the interbreeding is the important thing there with species. Okay? All right, well, we're not done. We've got more. Organ systems. Okay, so we go down to the individual level, and then below that we have organ systems. And those are groups of different organs performing a general function. The cardiovascular system, heart, blood vessels, which provide transport functions in an individual. The respiratory system that provides gas exchange, the ability to intake oxygen and to get rid of carbon dioxide. The nervous system, which provides all of the motor and sensory functions. How you sense the environment, how you perceive the environment, how you interact with the environment. Nervous system. So those are organ systems. Organs then are organized tissues within those organ systems that do specific functions. Okay? The brain, it's a processing center within the nervous system. The heart, it's the pumping organ of the cardiovascular system. Right? Those are examples. Right? Tissues, right? One level lower. We're looking at cooperative groups of similar cells doing specific functions. Tissue types include things like epithelial tissues, which cover surfaces, or muscle tissue, which provides movement. Nerve tissue, which provides electrical transport, basically, in our bodies. Sensory functions, motor functions, that sort of thing. Right. A cell, very, very important concept for the rest of this class. The cell is the basic unit of a biological system. Okay? It's the basic unit of life. If you break down a cell, its components may show some aspects of living systems, but it will not show all of the aspects of those living systems. Excuse me. All right? So, cell is the basic unit. You can't break life down any further than a cell without losing some of its properties. Right? It's separated from the environment by a membrane of some sort so that you have a definition what's inside the cell versus what's outside the cell. Okay? Well, we're not done there. Especially in the early part of this class, learning the language is a tough business, especially if you haven't been exposed to all of these terms. Okay? An organelle, right, is a specific structure within a cell that does a certain function. Okay? We'll not deal much with those until we get into Chapter 4 and we look at actually what's in cells and how cells are constructed. And then we'll deal with it. Okay? We go down one level further, and we're looking at the molecular level. A molecule, a cluster of atoms attached in specific ways. And then an atom is the smallest unit of matter. We'll get into this in much more detail in Chapter 2. Okay? So it's the smallest unit of matter that still retains all of the properties of matter. Okay? You can, in fact, break atoms down into smaller subunits. And those subunits you can break down into smaller subunits. But at that point it gets, well, as I said, it gets weird. Right? Take subatomic physics if you're curious. It's actually really interesting. That was my favorite part of physics, was subatomic physics, but it gets weird when you get down to those levels. Okay? Nothing makes sense anymore. All right, so there are some definitions. Now, the other thing that you're going to find in these slideshows, and it's something I've tried to incorporate because it's sort of a pain in the butt to try and just see all this stuff and incorporate it all, are these slides that say, have you got it? They're basically sample exam questions, right, that you can think about. So this first one, for example, the tree in your backyard is home to 2 birds, ant nest, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. Together, what do these constitute? Right? Are they a species, population, community, ecosystem, or none of the above? Okay. Think about that. If you're not sure, discuss it with your neighbor. I'll give you about 30 seconds. What I really need is that little ditty from Jeopardy that I can turn on right about now. Okay, first of all, I'll preface this by saying there's nothing wrong with being wrong right now. There's certainly something wrong with being wrong on the exam, but we're not there yet. How many people think it's A? Okay, that's good. How many people say B? Okay. C? Okay. D? Okay, good. So we're sort of torn between a community and an ecosystem. The difference between a community and an ecosystem is that a community is all of the biotic, the living components. An ecosystem includes all of the biotic and abiotic components. Okay? So given that knowledge, you can eliminate D as an answer. All right? It is actually a community. And the reason is because this is a list of biotic components. There's nothing abiotic listed there. Okay? These are all living organisms that are listed. So if we just look at those components, we're looking at a community. All right? Now, yes?
Is a nest not living? This is an ant nest.
Yeah, ant nest. That's supposed to mean all of the ants that are in the nest. Okay, I can see I'm going to have to be a little more literal with people. I'll have to say ants in a nest. Okay. Good point, though. Okay. So there's an example of the kind of question you might get asked on an exam. You also see what I sort of favor here. You had to know the definitions, but you had to apply them as well. Okay? You had to think, okay, I know what a community is, I know what an ecosystem is, which definition applies the best? All right, so we go back to our original figure, and we see now that we're looking at this nice hierarchical system, and we can study all of these different levels and hopefully get a much stronger or clearer picture of what biology really is all about. Right? We call this the reductionist approach, where we go from larger unit to smaller unit. Reductionism gained a real vogue, I guess, probably in the 40s and 50s when molecular biology first started to gain its impetus. Right? People thought, oh, this is great, because now we can reduce biology to its chemical components, understand the chemistry, and understand what biology is all about. That hasn't happened because biological systems are very, very complicated. I don't think we'll ever understand really how the human mind works, because there's so much going on there. Yeah, it's a sum of all of the interactions, chemical and cellular interactions going on, but how does that work? It's going to be tough to figure out. All right, so by looking at smaller and smaller pieces, we hope to get a clearer picture of how biological systems actually operate. But if you ask why life works, you're going into an area where you have to use the scientific method. Okay? As I said on Monday, science is not the facts. Science is the process by which we obtain basic facts about the universe. That's what science is. Okay? It's not the facts themselves. All right, so we're beginning to enter the scientific method. What is the scientific method? How do we use it? There's basically two different methods in science. Okay, one of those is observational or discovery science. And as the name suggests, what you're doing is you're just making a bunch of observations about a particular system or phenomenon. Okay? So you make observations regarding a natural phenomenon, and you derive general principles from many independent observations. Okay, that's called inductive reasoning. From that you come to a conclusion. Okay, what best explains my observations is really what you're asking or saying. Okay? Those conclusions can be tested, though. And that's the best kind of observational science. You make a whole bunch of observations, you come to some conclusion, and that conclusion can be tested by making further observations. Okay? For example, you make some observations that suggest that the dinosaurs were killed off by a huge meteor that slammed into Earth, right? Raised these huge dust clouds, caused basically something equivalent to a nuclear winter, and the temperatures dropped and they all died. All right? That conclusion makes predictions about further observations. Okay? You would predict that you should be able to observe some remnant of that meteor's falling or slamming into the Earth. Okay? You predict that you shouldn't find lots of dinosaur fossils above that line in the history of Earth where that meteor fell. Okay? That's what I mean by making predictions based on your conclusion from your observations. That's very powerful science. Okay? Don't think that just because you can't experiment on it doesn't mean that it isn't strong science. Okay? A lot of evolutionary biology comes from observational science, making predictions and finding that the predictions hold true. Very powerful method. Right? The other method is hypothesis-driven science. Okay? You make an educated guess about a phenomenon, and you test to see if your guess is right. That's basically what you're doing. You make an educated guess, test it to see if the guess is correct. Right? So a hypothesis is an educated guess about a phenomenon, a tentative explanation that may be based on observation. It may be based on other experiments that you've done. Okay? Whatever, it is an educated guess about that natural phenomenon. You're trying to figure out how it works. Okay? The hypothesis must be testable. I cannot emphasize this enough. If a hypothesis is not testable, it is not science, period. Okay? This is where a lot of things that people call science just fall short. Right? They are not science because you can't test them. Right? So the hypothesis must be testable. The test is typically an experiment. Although in observational science, you may actually be going out and testing your prediction by making other observations. Right? In a sense, that's a test of a hypothesis too. Okay, so observational science and hypothesis-driven science are the two methods that we use. All right, simple example from your book. You make some observations. Okay, those observations suggest a question. That question is usually as simple as, what's causing this phenomenon? Or why does this organism do this particular function? Okay. How and why questions are typical in science. That leads to a hypothesis, a tentative explanation. You may base that on other people's work. You may base that on your own observations, but it's a tentative explanation. You then make a prediction from that hypothesis and test that prediction by doing an experiment. If the experiment does not support the hypothesis, you revise it or you throw it out. It's no good. Okay? And scientists must be willing to throw out their hypotheses if they're not supported by their experiments or observations. Okay? Unfortunately, a lot of scientists are not willing to do that. There's a lot of dogmatism in science right now. There always has been, I think. Well, for example, in the 16th century, when people first started using microscopes to look at things like sperm cells, they imagined that they saw little preformed humans in these sperm cells, right, that gave rise to the individual when it was born. Okay, they were called spermists. And the individuals that supported this hypothesis actually believed that they'd seen these things, and it was sort of dogma for a long, long time. If, however, the test supports the hypothesis, then you can make additional predictions. If the test supports the hypothesis, have you proved the hypothesis true? No, you haven't. In fact, it's a funny thing about science that you can never prove anything true. And now you may be shocked to hear a scientist say that, but that's the way it is. You can never prove anything true. You can only prove something false, right, by this method. But you can gain so much evidence to support a particular conclusion that to not make that conclusion would be silly. Okay? That's how science works. As we gather more and more data that support an observation or a hypothesis, that hypothesis gains more acceptance and becomes a theory. A theory in biology is a well-accepted set of conclusions based on a large amount of supporting evidence. Right? That's why we say theory of evolution. It's not just a theory. It's supported by a very large body of evidence. Okay? It's equivalent to a law in other sciences. Right? The law of gravitation in physics, the gas laws in chemistry. The, quote, law of evolution is as well supported as those are. Okay? It's just that in biology we call them theories instead of laws. All right, simple example from your book. Your flashlight doesn't work. Well, heck. That's the observation. Question. Why? All right, simple question. As I said, in science, you often see how questions or why questions. Why doesn't this work? How does this work? That sort of thing. There's your hypothesis. The battery's dead. Right? The battery has gotten discharged, and so there's no more energy in the battery. You can make a prediction from that hypothesis, right? You would predict that if this is true. Now look at the way this is set up. We're using if, then statements. If you see if-then statements, those are generally predictions, experiments, and predicted results. Okay, so if this hypothesis is true and you replace the battery, then the flashlight should work. Yeah, I know, it's sort of a brain-dead example, but it's a good one. It's a simple one. All right, so you do the experiment. You take the battery out, you get a new one. You're making an assumption there, too, aren't you? You're assuming that the battery that you're putting in is a good battery. Right? That's another thing that we do in science a lot. We make assumptions, and we have to justify those assumptions. Right? So you could justify your assumption by saying, well, I just went to Walmart and bought it, so it ought to be good. Right? It's dated, so the date hasn't expired on it, so it should be a good battery. All right, so we do the experiment. Come on. There we go. Okay, so there's the person doing the experiment. If you put a new battery in and the flashlight works, your hypothesis is supported. Okay? In this example, it's sort of hard to see that you haven't proved the hypothesis true. Okay? You simply added more support for the hypothesis. But if you put batteries in and the flashlight doesn't work, you've demonstrated that your hypothesis was false. You have to go to another hypothesis. You throw out the hypothesis that the battery was dead. You go to another hypothesis. Maybe the light is burnt out, okay? Or maybe the battery contacts are not making good connection with the battery itself. All right, so it has to be revised, modified, thrown out for a different one. Okay? If nothing works, you could always blame the supernatural. We do that a lot, right? Every day we sort of ascribe things to the supernatural. You hear noises in your apartment or your house, and you think it's a poltergeist. You find something where you didn't put it, or you don't think you put it, and you think someone moved it, or something moved it. Okay? The supernatural, well, it's a nice little fallback, but it isn't science. All right? The supernatural is not science because you cannot form testable hypotheses based on supernatural phenomena. All right? That's why a lot of creationist hypotheses, they're not science, plain and simple, because they're not testable. Okay? You can't show them to be false. All right? So you've got to use a scientific method. All right, so let's see if you got it. There's a statement. All right, so what kind of statement is this? Is it a hypothesis? Is it inductive reasoning? Rationalization? Hypothetico-deductive reasoning, that is the hypothesis experiment approach, or is it an observation? Okay. Take about 30 seconds and try to figure that one out. Okay. Let's go back to this and try to figure out what the kind of statement is. All right? How many people say it's a hypothesis? Okay, few people. B, discovery science logic. Okay, few people. Rationalization. Okay. D, hypothetico-deductive reasoning. Okay, there's the majority, it looks like. And then E, an observation. Okay, just a few people. Okay. So we're all sort of spread out over the ball field here. The thing that's key in this statement is the if-then that's present. Okay? Always look for that if-then, because hypothetical-deductive reasoning uses if-then statements all the time. You're making a prediction. If A, then B. Okay? That's the logic that's used. Therefore, the correct answer for this question is D. It's not a hypothesis. It's not a tentative explanation. Okay? It's an if-then statement. It's a predictive statement in a sense. If all vertebrates have backbones and turtles are vertebrates, then turtles have backbones. That's a prediction. You can confirm that prediction by dissecting a turtle and seeing if it has a backbone. Okay? That's how you test your hypothesis. Okay? But this is hypothetical-deductive reasoning. Okay? Does everybody see why that is? So that if is that yes.
What were those words that you spit out that say that this is the hypothetical?
Okay, what are the key words that you should look for? The if-then. Okay, that if-then statement is a classic hypothetical-deductive approach. Okay, so always look for those if-then statements. If you see the if-then, then you're pretty sure. You can be pretty sure that's the answer. Okay. Any other questions on that? Yes.
What would an example of like rationalization and discovery science logic?
Discovery science logic would be if you say, I observe that all ants have wings. Okay? Therefore, any ants I observe in the future should have wings. Right? That would be the kind of thing that you do for an observational prediction. You've observed something, and so future observation should match your prediction. That would be an example. Well, rationalization, we rationalize all the time. The rationalization just says, well, I'm going to rationalize the statement by saying, well, okay, I've seen turtles, therefore they must have backbones. That sort of thing. Not a very good approach. All right, experiments. I haven't said much about experiments. Experiments must be controlled. Okay, you can't have a whole bunch of different things going on in experiments because then you won't know what's causing what you observe in the experiment. Right? So we find that experiments in science, if you're using the hypothetical-deductive approach, must be controlled experiments. Okay, there's two groups, an experimental group and a control group. The experimental group is the one that you're testing. The control group is the one that you're not. Right? Those are there so that you can be sure of what's going on in the experimental group. And that may not make much sense, but let me give you some examples of what we're looking at. Right? The manipulated variable. There's basically three kinds of variables that we're going to be dealing with in these experiments. The manipulated variable, that's what you as a scientist change. Okay? So let's say you've got two groups of plants, and to one group of plants you give sugar water. Right? That's the manipulated variable. The other group you would not give them sugar water, you give them plain water. Okay? So that's the manipulated variable. The responding variable is what changes in response to the manipulation. It's what you observe. All right, so you're giving one group of plants sugar water, you're giving one group of plants regular water. What happens? What do you observe? What changes? Okay, how do the plants respond as a result of that? That's the responding variable. So perhaps you're measuring something about the plant. You're measuring the plant growth over a period of time. However you choose to do that, you might measure the leaf diameter or the stem length or something like that. Okay? So that would be the responding variable. Controlled variables is everything else, and it should be the same between the two groups. And the key here, and I don't think I wrote this down, so write this down. The key is that there should be one difference between the control group and the experimental group. One difference between the control group and the experimental group. Okay? One variable. That's why you control everything else. In the example I gave of these plants, you would want the temperature to be the same, the humidity to be the same, the amount of soil is the same, the amount of nutrients are the same, the amount of light that they get is the same. I mean, you can come up with all kinds of controlled variables if you want to. And many times we'll assume that these variables are in fact being controlled. If you're doing this in an incubator, for example, then they should all be exposed to the same environment. All right, so manipulated variable, that's what you change. The responding variable is what changes in response to the manipulated variable. It's what you measure. Okay? So manipulated variable, what you change. Responding variable, what you measure. Controlled variable, what you make the same. All right, if you want simple single sentence or single phrase definitions for all those. Okay? What you change, what changes because of that, and what you make the same. All right. Another example from your book. Spiders are cool, but I'm an arachnophobe. Spiders are fine as far as I'm concerned as long as they stay in one place and I know where they are. They move around like these jumping spiders, they bug me. Jumping spiders are just cool, though. A jumping spider that's only a few millimeters in length can jump a couple of feet in length, right? Half a meter. And it's just amazing. They have very, very good eyes. You see these eyes in the front of their head right here? They actually have 8 of these eyes. There's 1, 2, 3, 4 of them that you can see right there. There's 2 more on the back and then a couple of little ones on the top that you can't see here. And they have nearly 360-degree vision. Those lenses in those eyes are so good that they can see shapes and define distinct shapes at a distance of 30 meters. Okay, in fact, there's a book in the library about spider biology, and there's this remarkable picture where they took the head of a jumping spider and they cleaned it out, and then they took a photograph through it, through those lenses. And it turns out that those lenses can see a shape, another jumping spider, and discern that it is in fact a spider at 30 meters. It's just incredible. They have exceptionally good eyes. They have an advantage we don't. Their retina slides around inside their head, right? The light-gathering tissue layer. You'll know that each of our eyes has a separate retina in the back, and it just stays there, right? And it gathers light. And that's how we perceive light. With them, they can slide it around from one side to the other, and you'll actually see it moving around inside their head. If you ever see a jumping spider, you can move your finger around in front of them and follow your finger. Very, very good eyesight. Okay, so there's my spiders are cool thing. I'm still an arachnophobe. Nothing will cure that. All right, on the right, we've got a snowberry fly. Now look at the back end of this snowberry fly. Doesn't that look a lot like a spider? Look at those markings on the wings. Those look exactly like the bends that you'd see in the front of a spider, a jumping spider. Okay, this is an example of what we call mimicry. All right, here's another term you'll need to know. One organism looks like another, therefore gains a benefit or advantage. Okay, real good example of mimicry. They're fun to watch too. I wish I had an animation of it because they flash their wings and it spreads those leg markings out. And that's exactly what spiders do when these jumping spiders do when they confront each other. Right? They spread their legs out. They display to each other. It's really cool. All right, so the observation. Snowberry flies that wave their wings in a specific pattern mimic the territorial movements that jumping spiders do to each other. That's basically what these jumping spiders are doing. They're saying to each other, hey, I'm already in this territory. You got to back off because it's mine. Okay? And then the other one is saying, oh, no, you don't either. I came here. I'm going to take over. So that's what they're saying to each other. Well, the snowberry fly is basically saying to the spider, I'm a spider, and this is my territory, so back off. Okay? So that fools the spider and prevents capture. That's the hypothesis. There's our educated guess about what this phenomenon is all about. Okay? The flies are trying to fool trying, if we would be anthropomorphic, to fool the spider. Come on. All right, so we do an experiment. The control group, we always have a control and experimental group. The control group is flies that we don't do anything to. All right, so they have all of their markings. The experimental group we're going to do something to get rid of those markings. Okay? In fact, we're going to paint those markings over so that they're no longer there. All right? So we can then make our prediction. What we're going to predict is that if those markings are important signals to tell the spiders to back off, then when you paint them over, those flies should get attacked more often because they can't make the signals. Okay? How do we distinguish which group is attacked more frequently? We gather data. All right? Keep this in mind. Data is plural. Datum is singular. So you don't say this data. Okay? You'd have to say these data because it is plural. Okay? You'd say this datum, which is a single piece of data. We count. Okay? The best data is quantitative, numerical, because you can do statistics with it. Okay? You don't want to do just simple observations because that's just anecdotes. All right? Anecdotes are not science. A lot of people think they are. You read these case histories of how somebody went on this fabulous high-fat diet and they lost 70 pounds. Okay? They just ate bacon for a month. Okay. All right, so fine, that person lost 70 pounds. That's an anecdotal piece of evidence. It's not science. It's not a test. Okay, so be wary of anecdotal stuff, especially when you're looking at some of these kinds of claims. All right, so we have controlled confrontations. Here are the results. What we're looking at is the pounce rate. We just measure the percent of trials in which the spider attacks the fly. The control group, the untreated flies, they're only attacked 20% of the time. The experimental group, where the wing markings are marked over, they're attacked almost twice as much. Therefore, the hypothesis is supported in this case. The markings really do lower the attack rate on the flies. It helps keep them safe. All right, now, just to emphasize what I said earlier, there is nothing in science that can be proven. You can only disprove. Okay, support for a hypothesis is support, but it's not proof. Okay, so be wary of saying that your data prove your hypothesis. They do not. They support your hypothesis. You may think that's splitting hairs, but it really isn't. Okay, you gain more confidence in your hypothesis if your experiment supports it. But you could still do another experiment that demonstrates that your hypothesis was in fact false. Okay, so be careful. If you have tons of support, though, then to not accept the conclusion as true would just be silly. Okay? That's why evolution, among a lot of other concepts in biology, is accepted as fact. Okay? It's got so much support that to not accept it as true would simply be silly. Okay? It's supported by other fields other than biology as well. Right? Without these methods, we'd be assuming something just because. We do that a lot, too. We say, oh, well, I know this is true because so-and-so told me it was true, or because I read it in a book that I don't have any corroborative evidence for. Okay? We do that a lot, but it's not science, and it's not a valid conclusion. Okay? There's nothing wrong with that. I'm not saying that you shouldn't make conclusions like that, or turn to the supernatural. Just realize that if you're doing so, it's not science. Right? Plain and simple. Okay, we'll stop there. And when we come back on Friday, this is where we'll start up by looking at the diversity of living organisms. We may get into the early part of Chapter 2 next time, so start reading ahead a little bit.